The first American soldiers to face World War II did not storm beaches in Europe. They did not march triumphantly into enemy territory. They waited, hungry, outnumbered, and slowly abandoned. In the final weeks of 1941, the United States still believed it had time. Time to mobilize, time to prepare, time to decide how and where to fight. But half a world away in the Philippines, time was already running out. What unfolded there would become America's first great military nightmare of World War II, a failure shaped not by lack of courage, but by confusion, false assumptions, and decisions made far too late. What American commanders did not realize was that the defense of the Philippines had already begun to collapse before the first Japanese bomb ever fell. In December 1941, the Philippine Islands were the most valuable American possession in the Pacific, strategically placed, rich in resources, and dangerously exposed. For decades, U.S. war planners understood one hard truth: if Japan ever attacked, the Philippines could not be saved quickly. Reinforcements would take months, supplies even longer. The islands would have to hold on alone. That reality gave birth to War Plan Orange. The plan was brutally honest. In the event of a Japanese invasion, U.S. and Filipino forces would withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor. There, they would dig in, conserve strength, and wait not to win, but to survive until the U.S. Navy could fight its way across the Pacific. But by 1941, American confidence had shifted, too much, as it turned out. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of U.S. Army forces in the Far East, believed the old plan was outdated. He was convinced the Philippines could be defended at the beaches. His forces, he argued, were stronger than ever. Filipino troops were training. American air power was expanding. The enemy, he believed, could be stopped before setting foot on shore. This decision would later prove critical. MacArthur scrapped War Plan Orange in practice, though not on paper. Supplies were moved forward. Units were spread thin across thousands of miles of coastline. Defensive positions were scattered. The assumption was simple: Japan would not dare attack while America stood alert. The warning signs were already there. By late 1941, Japanese forces were massing across the Pacific. Intelligence reports grew darker by the week. Yet American commanders in the Philippines remained caught between two plans, one realistic, one optimistic, and fully committed to neither. Then came December 7th. While Americans awoke to the devastation at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines stood on the edge of disaster. Due to the international date line, it was already December 8th in Manila. News of the attack arrived early that morning. The war had begun. U.S. air commanders now faced a single, urgent priority: protect their aircraft. American bombers and fighters in the Philippines were among the largest concentrations of air power in the Pacific. If they survived, they could strike back at Japan. But hesitation followed. Aircraft remained parked wingtip to wingtip. Crews waited for orders. Reconnaissance flights were delayed. No full-scale dispersal was ordered. For hours, nothing happened. Japanese pilots, flying from bases in Formosa, needed only time, and time was exactly what they were given. Late that morning, Japanese bombers appeared over Clark Field. Within minutes, the heart of American air power in the Philippines was being destroyed on the ground. Bombs ripped through runways. Fighters burned where they stood. Hangars collapsed in flames. By the end of the day, much of the U.S. Far East Air Force no longer existed. America had lost control of the skies without ever truly contesting them. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Without air cover, American naval forces withdrew. Supply lines became exposed. Coastal defenses, already thin, were now helpless against Japanese landings. And Japan was just getting started. Within days, Japanese troops poured onto Luzon. Their landings were faster, more coordinated, and more aggressive than American planners had expected. Filipino and U.S. units attempted to resist along the beaches just as MacArthur had planned, but they were scattered, undertrained, and unsupported. Communications broke down, orders arrived late or not at all. Units fought bravely, then fell back in confusion. Roads clogged with refugees. Equipment was abandoned. Ammunition ran short. Quietly, almost without announcement, commanders realized the truth. The Philippines could not be held. War Plan Orange was finally put into motion, but now it was too late. The retreat to Bataan began under fire, with Japanese forces closing in from every direction. What was meant to be an organized withdrawal became a desperate race against collapse. And the men retreating into the jungle had no idea just how long they would be asked to hold, or how completely they would be forgotten. The retreat into Bataan was not a single movement. It was a series of narrow escapes, broken units, and desperate rearguard actions stitched together by exhaustion and fear. American and Filipino forces fell back through choking jungle roads, often at night, often under fire. Trucks ran out of fuel and were abandoned. Artillery pieces were pushed into ravines when they could no longer be moved. Food dumps meant to supply months of defense were overrun or destroyed before they could be reached. War Plan Orange assumed order. Reality delivered chaos. By early January 1942, nearly 80,000 men crowded into the Bataan Peninsula. They were hungry, poorly supplied, and already worn down by weeks of fighting. Many had been marching and skirmishing non-stop since the first days of the invasion. Malaria and dysentery spread quickly. Medical supplies vanished. Rations were cut again and again until men survived on a fraction of what they needed. What they didn't realize was that help was never coming. In Washington, strategic priorities had shifted almost immediately after Pearl Harbor. Europe came first. The Pacific would be fought defensively, at least for now. The U.S. Navy had been shattered. Any attempt to relieve the Philippines would be suicidal. But in Bataan, hope lingered. General MacArthur assured his men that relief forces were on the way, that the U.S. Navy would return, that they only needed to hold on. These promises were repeated again and again, filtering down through exhausted officers to starving soldiers in the trenches. The Japanese, meanwhile, were learning their own lessons. Initial assaults against Bataan underestimated the defenders. American artillery, though limited, was well handled. Filipino units fought stubbornly on familiar ground. Jungle ambushes slowed Japanese advances. Casualties mounted. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the line might hold. But time was on Japan's side. Japanese commanders adapted quickly. They tightened their supply lines. They brought up heavier artillery. They cut off escape routes. And above all, they waited, allowing hunger and disease to do what bullets could not. Inside Bataan, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Men grew skeletal. Uniforms rotted off their bodies. Malaria left soldiers shivering in the tropical heat. Hospitals overflowed with wounded who could not be evacuated. Medicines were gone. Bandages were reused until they fell apart. Ammunition became precious. Artillery crews counted shells one by one. Rifles were cleaned obsessively, not for combat readiness, but because a malfunction could not be afforded. Still, the line held. And then, in March 1942, another blow fell. President Franklin Roosevelt ordered General MacArthur to leave the Philippines. The decision was strategic. MacArthur was too valuable to lose, but the effect on morale was devastating. In the dead of night, MacArthur slipped out of Corregidor by PT boat, eventually reaching Australia. His famous promise followed him, "I shall return." The men left behind heard something else. They heard that they were expendable. Command passed to General Jonathan Wainwright, and on Bataan itself to General Edward King, a commander who understood the truth far better than anyone in Washington. The troops were no longer capable of sustained defense. They were collapsing physically. Units reported combat effectiveness at fractions of their original strength. Yet surrender was unthinkable. American military culture had no language for it, no precedent, no plan. The Japanese launched their final offensive in early April. Heavy bombardments smashed the already weakened defenses. Japanese troops advanced against men who could barely stand, let alone fight. Lines buckled, then snapped. On April 9, 1942, with his army disintegrating and no hope of relief, General King made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He surrendered Bataan. It was the largest surrender in American military history. But the suffering was only beginning. The surrender of Bataan did not end the nightmare. It stripped away the last illusion of protection. Nearly 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers laid down their weapons, believing or hoping that the rules of war still applied, that captivity would mean survival, that surrender, however painful, would at least spare them from death. What awaited them instead was something far darker. The Japanese army had not prepared to take prisoners on this scale. Their logistics were designed for victory, not custody. Food was scarce, guards were few, and deeply ingrained within Japanese military culture was the belief that surrender was dishonorable. To many of the guards, these men were not soldiers anymore. They were disgraced. Within hours, the long march north began. The prisoners were ordered to move in columns under a burning tropical sun. No food was issued, no water was provided. Men who collapsed were beaten. Those who could not rise were bayoneted or shot where they lay. This was the beginning of what would become known as the Bataan Death March. For days, the columns moved slowly along dusty roads, bodies piled at the roadside. The sick were dragged along by friends who were barely alive themselves. Thirst drove men to madness. Some drank from puddles contaminated with fuel or human waste. Many never rose again. Japanese guards, exhausted and under orders to move fast, enforced discipline with brutality. Beatings were random. Executions were casual. Entire groups were punished for the actions of one man. No one was in control. By the time the survivors reached the prison camps, thousands were already dead. And still, the disaster of the Philippines was not finished. Across Manila Bay, Corregidor held on. The island fortress, nicknamed the Rock, had been the symbol of American power in the Pacific. Its massive guns once promised to dominate the sea approaches, but without air cover, without naval support, Corregidor was a fortress in name only. Japanese artillery pounded it relentlessly. Bombs collapsed tunnels. Food stocks vanished. Wounded men lay in darkness beneath the island as shockwaves shook the rock above them. General Wainwright understood the reality. The island could not hold. Continuing resistance would only mean more deaths with no military value. On May 6, 1942, Corregidor surrendered. With that, the Philippines were lost. In just 5 months, the United States had gone from a Pacific power to a defeated occupier, its soldiers scattered across prison camps, its strategy in ruins. The implications were enormous. Japan now controlled a vast arc of territory stretching across Southeast Asia. American credibility had been shattered. Allies questioned whether the United States could protect anything at all. But perhaps the most haunting consequence was silence. For years, the men captured in the Philippines would be cut off from the world. Families received little or no information. Many believed their loved ones dead. Others would never know the full truth of what happened. Inside the camps, starvation continued. Forced labor followed. Disease spread unchecked. Thousands more would die before the war ended. The failure to defend the Philippines was not a single mistake. It was a chain of decisions, outdated assumptions, delayed reactions, and misplaced confidence, all colliding at the worst possible moment. It was America's first major test of World War II. And it had failed. But the story did not end in defeat. Because the lessons learned in the Philippines would shape every American operation that followed. And the promise made in the darkness, "I shall return," would eventually be tested. When American forces finally returned to the Philippines in 1944, the land they found bore little resemblance to the one they had lost. Cities were shattered, villages were burned, entire regions had been hollowed out by occupation, guerrilla warfare, and retaliation. For the men who survived captivity, the liberation came too late to erase the memory of what had happened, but it did give meaning to their endurance. General Douglas MacArthur waded ashore at Leyte in October 1944, cameras rolling as he fulfilled his promise. The moment was symbolic, carefully staged, and instantly historic, but beneath the triumph lay an unspoken truth. Returning did not undo the failure. The fall of the Philippines remains one of the most sobering episodes in American military history because it was not inevitable. Courage was abundant. Sacrifice was overwhelming. What failed was preparation, clarity, and realism. The United States entered the Pacific War assuming deterrence would hold. It assumed air power could be protected without immediate action. It assumed outdated plans could be replaced on the fly. Each assumption shaved away the margin for error until there was none left. The defense of the Philippines collapsed not in a single battle, but in the space between decisions. Between a war plan that acknowledged reality and a commander who believed it could be rewritten. Between intelligence warnings and delayed responses. Between promises of relief and the strategic truth that no relief was coming. For the soldiers on Bataan, these gaps were measured in hunger, disease, and death. For the prisoners who survived the Death March, the war would never truly end. Many carried the physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Others did not live long enough to see liberation at all. The disaster also reshaped American strategy. Never again would U.S. forces be left without clear plans for reinforcement or evacuation. Never again would air power sit exposed on the ground in the face of imminent attack. The Pacific War that followed, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, was fought with lessons paid for in the jungles of Luzon. The Philippines was the first warning. It showed what happened when overconfidence met reality, when courage was asked to compensate for strategic failure, when soldiers were sent to hold the line with promises that could not be kept. And it stands as a reminder that in war, defeat does not always come from being outmatched. Sometimes it comes from being unprepared to admit the truth.